Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Advanced Center for International Justice and the Bard Globalization International Affairs James Chace Lecture Series. It is very nice to see so many people here for such an interesting and important topic. I just want to mention a word about the lecture series named after James Chace, the co-founder of the Bard Globalization International Affairs Program, the former editor of World Policy Journal, Foreign Affairs Magazine, and professor at Bard. And we do these lectures in his memory, and I think he would very much like this topic and be happy that we're carrying on in his name. Also, I want to mention that what the Bard Globalization International Affairs Program is. We offer the opportunity through Bard College to have students come to New York City for a semester or a summer to take courses with scholar practitioners and to do internships at a variety of institutions around the city that in one way or another focus on international affairs. And we define that in a pretty broad way. I'd also like to mention that we have with us this evening 17 international scholars who are here as part of the Bard U.S. Foreign Policy Institute that we hold every summer and is supported by the U.S. Department of State's study of the U.S. institutes. And so we're very happy to have them here as well. So Tom, welcome to the Van Center, to the BGIA lecture series, and to New York City, where everyone's an expert in everything. So we're happy to have you here. And so speaking, let's just start off with, I think we'll mention the word expert and expertise many times this evening. But you are an expert in Russian politics and nuclear weapons. So what prompted you to write a book about something other than your two areas of expertise?
Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for having me. And having known James Chace, it's an honor to be part of a series in his memory. So, really delighted to be here with you. And I apologize for being somewhat late. The first global problem we have to tackle is train infrastructure in America, which is why I was late. So, well, it is a strange, it was kind of a strange topic for somebody who normally writes on Russian affairs, nuclear weapons, preventive war, the usual cheerful holiday reading kind of thing, to write about this, but it actually was linked to it. Over the years, I had always been surprised by anti-intellectualism in American life, which is something that a lot of people have commented on. Richard Hofstadter wrote a groundbreaking book on it. Tocqueville talked about it over 200 years ago. And I kind of accepted that when you're in a professional capacity and you're an expert, people just do that people want to argue about important things, and I think that's actually a very positive part of American culture, that we don't instantly defer to rank or class or intellectual achievement, that we kind of ask questions for ourselves. But it seemed that was changing over the past 15 or 20 years, where people were not just asking questions, but literally trying to replace experts, to say, I'm not just someone questioning you, I'm not just your client or your student, I'm your peer. And during the Edward Snowden affair, I was talking with someone, actually had many conversations with people about Russia. And of course, at that time, 3 or 4 years ago, there were a lot of folks that want to believe that the Russians might be involved in this. And someone who was talking about this with me finally turned to me and said, Tom, let me explain Russia to you. And I said, okay, something's changed in the culture. It's one thing to say, I know you're an expert and I want to hear your explanation and I need you to convince me or to tell me. It's another thing entirely to have someone who, up until 3 months earlier had never really thought about Russia turn to you and say, no, I'm going to explain Russia to you. Let me kind of make this clear to you. So I sat down and just blasted off a long therapeutic blog piece, which was the equivalent of me shaking my fist at clouds. And it went from there, and that was the first step into it, and then it just kind of took off and went viral from there.
So the epiphany for this really was a conversation that you were having with somebody face to face, because in the book you point the finger pretty seriously at the internet and social media as one of the drivers what makes it different now. Why is it different than what Hofstadter was talking about in the early 1960s, what Tocqueville was talking about in the 1800s? And so, given how much you focus on social media, it's just interesting to me that it was actually a face-to-face conversation that put you over the edge.
In fairness, though, that it was one of dozens of conversations, most of which had been on social media. It was just striking to me that that it was because at first I kind of dismissed this as, well, it's just a social media problem. But then I found that there were people very willing to do it in three dimensions, to say, and when I was giving a public talk, and people would say, let me explain national security to you, let me explain the Defense Department to you, let me explain. And this was just, I think, the final straw that broke the camel's back, because it was so close to my own area of expertise, and it was so esoteric. But social media had, I think, primed me to react to that, because I was seeing it in immense numbers on Twitter and Facebook. So I think social media has been a serious culprit in this. But as I say in the book, I think that this phenomenon began several years ago, at least 3 or 4 decades ago. I think it's part of a larger social movement, and I think it's actually part of a global social change. When I first started writing about this, I thought, well, this is probably an American thing. As you say, Hofstadter talking about the average person not really understanding their toaster, or how do they make their own breakfast. What struck me as I wrote the first iterations of this was that I started getting mail from all over the world, from professionals around the world who were sending me mail saying, thank God someone's finally talking about this. Because a story that I always tell, I actually got an email from a molecular biologist in France who said, I have this experience all the time. Of course, the first thing I thought is, who argues with a molecular biologist? And he said, I'd like to translate your essay into French and put it up in my lab, because I'm tired of having these kinds of arguments. And as of this moment, the book is already under contract to be translated into Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Finnish.
Well, but that conversation you had with a molecular biologist is interesting to me, because I think it gets to the question of how the book has been received by people who consider themselves experts, but feel that now they are on the wrong end of this equation, and they're having to kind of suffer the slings and arrows of the challenges of the time that we live in. But I'm wondering how much that group of people, that cohort of experts, is willing to examine themselves and say, is there some place here we've gone wrong? Is there something that we've done in academia or in the field of science or in any of these areas, these domains in which we might say these are true experts, where there is some fault?
Sure. I think experts, in talking about this, I will say that the reaction has not been among experts globally or locally that it's been this universal acclaim of, you're our hero. I mean, I was just at an event yesterday, was talking about a talk I gave to a group, a working group from the National Academy of Sciences, and I was talking to someone who'd been there, and I said, well, I think if I were keeping score, that when I gave this talk, I made fans out of half the room and instantly alienated the other half of the room, who felt that no, this was they thought no, experts need to be called to account, and you're being too hard on the average person, the lay people, that they have good reason to be concerned. So I think experts do get that. The question is, to what degree is that the legitimate problem, as you ask, of expert failure in some way? Because this is the most common response I get from lay people. Look, we don't trust experts anymore because experts aren't any good. But underneath that, I think what a lot of experts are reacting to is not accusations of expert failure, it's accusations of bad faith. And that's where it really starts to become a serious social conflict. Because I think the problem of expert failure can be dealt with. I think this is, experts, I think, the two biggest mistakes they've made is they sometimes lack empathy, because we live in the world of data, we live in the world of ideas, We work with the things we've worked with so long that we forget. I always said that the worst math teacher I ever had, turned me off to math, was someone for whom trigonometry was never a known and natural thing, right? I think the best thing about being a teacher, and I try to do this, is to say, always remember there was a day you didn't know it, that you didn't know what a cosine was. So I think experts fall into that and say, well, of course, you don't understand, basic microeconomics of firm taxation. And I think the other place where experts, but this leads into the social issue, where experts have been less than forthcoming has been in dealing openly with cases of expert failure and being transparent about that and showing our work and saying, here's how we police ourselves, here's how we review our own work, here's how we call out the frauds in our own midst, here's how we deal with misconduct. But the reason I think that happens is because lay people, in an earlier time, lay people would say, look, we get it, expertise, there's no such thing as a perfect track record. Apollo 11 was a great success. Apollo 13 was nearly a horrendous failure. And and they would look at that and say, people do their best. Now, because lay people feel like experts are controlling their lives, they feel it's very empowering to say, aha, every sign of expert failure means that I no longer have to listen to experts at all. And so experts have gone into a defensive crouch to say, okay, then we're pretty much never wrong and we're not going to talk about it when we are.
But going into that defensive crouch usually results in kind of doubling down in using a language that's the most opaque, the least accessible, that in one way or another tries to signify to the broader world, I am truly an expert. I am going to speak in this highly technical language to demonstrate
an exclusive language.
An exclusive language. Now, of course, and you point this out in the book, there are many times when that's appropriate, it's needed, and you're speaking to a specific community of like-minded experts in one's own field. But you're somebody, and we started off the conversation this way about why you wrote this book. This is not the first time you ventured out of your lane, out of your area of expertise. You've written on why young men engage in mass shootings. You write on all sorts of topics, but I'm sure you'd be the first to admit that's not always met with approval in the academy. That's all. It's not always seen as something that is beneficial to one's career. And you've done that, and you wade right into social media, and you take people on. But I think that there are other, more junior colleagues who would be unlikely to do that because they're worried about career consequences.
One important caveat that I would add to a lot of the things that I've written, for example, I've written about, as you point out, why do young men kill? But I wrote that as an opinion piece, and I wrote it in a journal of opinion. And I partly wrote it to try to draw out experts, to have people who are sociologists or criminologists inform me, because I put that out there as without a peer review, without a scholarly imprimatur on it, to say, look, I'm an informed observer, I understand the basic rules of evidence, I understand social science and causation, so I'm taking a flyer here that's somewhat outside of my lane, but I'm asking a question in doing that. And I would never get out there and say, I have the answer. In fact, a lot of folks have suggested to me that should be my next book, that I should write this book about mass killers and kind of the radicalized losers. And I've been a little bit reluctant to do it because I think it's going to take me a few years of research to get up to the point where I would be confident to put that in front of a peer-reviewed process at a scholarly press. I think younger scholars, I think younger scholars are and should engage more in they should be, to use a phrase pioneered by Isaiah Berlin and that I use in the book, they should be more foxes than hedgehogs because of the interconnectedness of more and more problems. Unfortunately, the nature of academic disciplines tends to punish them for that. That we have become very narrow in our specialization. I've always found it, particularly as a Russia person, for example, from the day I started graduate school, I always found the division between international relations and comparative politics to be completely artificial. I didn't understand how anybody could study Russian foreign policy without understanding, in those days, Soviet foreign policy, because I'm old. But I never understood how people could say, well, without understanding, I just studied the Soviet Union as a thing in the world, but I don't understand anything about their political system. That made no sense to me. But I do think experts, unfortunately, and I have several examples of this in the book, where experts take the halo of expertise and then use it to get way out of their lane, to say, as the old joke goes, trust me, I'm a doctor. One of the examples I use was Helen Caldicott, an anti-nuclear activist from the 1980s, whose background in nuclear issues was that she was a pediatrician from Australia, who was scared by the book On the Beach. She admits this. I read On the Beach and it scared the hell out of me, so I decided to do this. Linus Pauling, an award-winning chemist who somehow got obsessed with the notion that vitamin C can cure AIDS. It can happen. And I think when those things do happen, the breakdown that I'm talking about in the book is that experts need to be able to step forward and say, look, we screwed up, we got some things wrong. But that doesn't mean we get everything wrong, and it doesn't mean that we are now peers. We can be wrong, but we're more likely to be right than you.
So, just because we might not have been right on how many eggs per week.
I was just thinking of eggs. Exactly.
We are in New York, the land of great diners.
Yes.
So how many eggs you can eat per week doesn't mean that you shouldn't vaccinate your children.
Exactly. And I will have you know, because I like eggs, I confronted my own doctor about this, and I was like, listen, quack. And he kind of laughed and he said, yeah, go ahead and eat all the eggs you want. They're good for you. He said, and then he explained to me, he said, we didn't understand a certain mechanism about how human beings metabolize cholesterol, and we're learning from it, and that's what experts do. But that doesn't mean that you can then leave your doctor's office and say, hey, those guys don't know anything. Cheeseburgers and beer for breakfast are just as good for you as anything else.
Yeah, but in that example, so not only did he say we got it wrong, he explained to you why they got it wrong, and you listened.
Yes.
And as I was reading your book, it just struck me over and over again that we also have a failure to listen, a failure on all sides to really seriously listen and have one's mind open enough to be able to have your opinion changed in the face of evidence to the contrary of what you thought before. Because in my experience, far too often people are saying, I believe X or I believe Y. As if it's a matter of faith, rather than saying, I think this, and here's why. And so once you put it into the category of belief, and it becomes embedded in someone's identity and the way that they present themselves to the world, then by challenging them on what they think about X or Y, you're challenging who they are as a person. And then you're off to the races.
Right.
Then you're on cable TV shouting at people, AM talk radio, and it's just two sides and kind of parallel ranting soliloquies and not a conversation where anyone's mind is even close to being changed. But how do we get from where we are and that sad state of affairs and inculcate this sense of being able to listen well and being able to change one's mind? We've drifted so far away from that. It's a tough thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is where I think it's a shortcoming in the book, where I don't have particularly compelling mechanism to change this, because I think this has been the adduced effect of years of growing narcissism in Western society. Whereas you point out, Jim, it's not just that, well, I think something. It's I believe this, and it's integral to my identity. And it's empowering. It's how I empower myself. It's how I feel good about myself. And if I have to change my mind, I have to change my conception of who I am. And I think that's a terrible leap that's been made. It used to be that the average person would say, well, all right, I guess I'm wrong about viruses, but that doesn't mean I'm not a good person. I think part of the problem now is people, and this is where social media does come in, people go into discussions with each other to affirm themselves and to win. They're not actually talking to other people to exchange information or to learn anything or even to establish intimacy. I mean, sometimes human beings just have conversations because, I mean, we've all done it. You pick up the phone and say, hey, what's new? What are you thinking about? And you're really not having a conversation about the news or the day. You just want to hear another person's voice, someone you care about. Increasingly, because we spend so much time alone and we spend so much time mediated through electronic media, we just go in there to say, I'm here to win. I'm here to make my point, and I'm here to dominate another person and to feel better about myself and to reassure myself that the things I believe are true, because if they're not, then my world starts coming undone.
And of course, those sorts of conversations online, not even conversations, those rants online become all the more toxic when they're done anonymously. And it's one anonymous person versus another, or if it's just someone calling into a radio talk show, that we have lost the ability to kind of be able to speak to one another, whether it's electronically or otherwise, and know who the other person really is, and know that you're revealing yourself as well, being able to kind of hide behind that veil of an online handle, I think is really toxic and leads to very damaging things. But in your book, you level a pretty blistering critique of higher education. It's kind of smack dab in the middle of the book, and maybe it's smack dab in the middle of this problem, and perhaps in the middle of the solution that we're talking around. Maybe you could just kind of summarize, where do you think things have gone wrong in American higher education and why?
Well, I think what's happened in higher education is a reflection of what's happened in K through 12 education as well. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be turning my back on everybody here. And what that is an effect of the growing movement that says that the most important thing to a child's development is self-esteem and happiness. And self-esteem and I'm a father, just to be clear. Sometimes you hear this from people say, "Oh, children don't need self-esteem. That's why I don't spend any time around them." I think it's important to give children confidence and resilience, but I think we've gone too far. I think we've gotten to the point. I don't want to go down the road of cliches about every kid gets a trophy, but every kid gets a trophy. And it's more than that. It's a notion that that children will learn and develop and reach the right answers and become smart if they're simply empowered enough. And I don't think that's true. I think I've been teaching now for 30 years, and I can say, having been a teacher and having been on the other side of some really good teachers, that sometimes breaking down willfulness. You asked about these anonymous trolls and people who just argue with each other to argue. In part, it's because we never approach any of these things with humility. And humility is a learned skill, and sometimes it's not a pleasant learned skill. I'll just tell a quick story of one of the greatest teachers I had. I talk about him in the book, but I don't relay this anecdote about him. Father Jim Shaw, who was my political philosophy professor when I started graduate school. And I'd gotten into Georgetown on a fellowship, just as a PhD student, and I thought I was pretty smart. And he starts his class by handing out this essay that I quote in the book called "What a Student Owes a Teacher." Well, first, imagine doing that today. Imagine, start walking into a top university classroom and saying, "No, before we begin, here's what you owe me as the teacher." Most students would, I think, be appalled. But I passed this class. The part of the story I didn't tell is that I got through this class, I argued with this imposing, steely-looking Jesuit, and at the end of the term I got an A, which made me think that I had climbed Mount Everest and I was just the smartest guy in the world. And so I walk up to him after class at the break in December at a Christmas party at the school, and I feel in my notes and I said, "Hey, Merry Christmas, Father, what do you say? Peace on earth, goodwill towards men?" And he just gave me this kind of fixed look over his glasses for a moment. He said, "What I say to you, Mr. Nichols, is repent." Which immediately, sort of, I said, okay. And he was on my doctoral committee after that. And after that, I said, we're not peers. This is someone who this is my teacher, and I love the guy. But I learned a quick lesson there for a moment. And I think that that's important. And I think, if someone asks me, how do we inculcate more critical thinking among younger children, even before college? And my somewhat glib, but nonetheless heartfelt answer is, stop telling them they're awesome. It's okay to tell children that they're wrong. It's okay to tell children that they're doing something incorrectly. It's okay to help them develop what in the book I talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect. If people don't know, they're not good at things. It's okay to help them develop the metacognition that lets them step back and know whether they're doing something well or not. And I think that is an important part of being a learner for life. And I don't think people are learners for life anymore. I think they get to a certain level of knowledge, they say, that's it, I've learned what I need to know, I'm as smart as everybody else, and they stop.
But I think another part of your story, and I also was educated by the Jesuits, so I can certainly relate, that it is the notion of authority. And at what point is it okay to challenge authority, and at what point do you have to accept not only the authority of expertise, but the authority of a certain hierarchy? And it seems to me that in your book you're saying that hierarchy that has worked so well for higher education for a long time, and the authority that is projected via that has broken down largely. I mean, my father was a high school teacher for many years, and he said that what changed over his time in teaching from the early 60s well into the 90s was not the students. He said, kids are kids. Many are great, some goof off, whatever. They're the same. He said what really changed were the parents. That if a student had gotten a bad grade in the 60s, the crazy, wild, wide open 60s, the parents, if they did get in touch with him, were likely to say, I'm very sorry. What can we do? How can Tommy turn this around?
After we're done grounding him.
Right. And that toward the end of his career, when the parents would call, the conversation would be quite different. They would basically say, I pay my taxes, you work for me. My kid's basically a genius. He's going to be going to Harvard Law School, and you're standing in the way of that. And I'm going to go to the school superintendent and tell him what a bad job you're doing. And that this is not just my father's experience. This is the experience of many people, and this has also crept into higher education. So this notion of authority, an authority of expertise, an authority of hierarchies and institutions, seems to me to be part of what you're talking about in your book.
The word, again, is narcissism. My child's a genius. My child is not, we are Lake Wobegon. All the children are above average. But I want to take on this question of authority because I think sometimes I'm misunderstood as making an argument that if your doctor walks in with a huge needle, you're supposed to say, okay, doc, whatever you say, just, whatever you think. That teachers, I actually had a needle point that my late mother did after I became a teacher that said, because I'm the teacher. And I took it down. As much as I loved it, that is never a good enough answer. I think most times that's not a good enough answer. Sometimes when students say, why do I have to take an exam? Well, because I'm the teacher. But most times, I don't, as much as I love that my mom made that, I didn't leave it in my office. And I think that breakdown of authority was part of a lack of trust in social institutions in general after the 60s and the 70s, after the Vietnam War, after Watergate, after the notion of democratization and mass education. Because the other thing that happened that led to more challenges in the classroom is that more people were going to school. When you and I were kids, going to college was not a mass experience. It was really a very rare thing. So I don't argue for this instant deference to authority. What I do argue is that for people to understand that in most cases, there's a reason that the teacher is standing in front of the room and the student is sitting in the chair. Challenge me, take me on, ask me questions. I will tell you all, by the way, I was a complete pain in the ass in high school. I was not a dutiful student. I was not an A student. I was not, I was considered, troublesome and outspoken, and I was not at all This is not me saying be the way I was in 1977, because the way I was in 1977, my dad got a lot of those calls that you're talking about. And
you got grounded.
And I, if I was lucky. My high school was it was a working class public high school. It was meant to prepare people to go to work in the local environment, and not particularly fond of sort of, wise ass, smart kids. So I'm sympathetic to that. But challenging authority simply for the sake of challenging authority, because it makes you feel empowered to challenge authority, is just stupid. It's simply, that makes it just about you. Well, I'm going to argue with my teacher because I have to argue with my teacher because I'm obviously smart. If you want to argue with your teacher because you have a good question and it's bothering you. Don't do it just to demonstrate to yourself that you're somehow an empowered and important person, because that gets you nowhere. That just frustrates everybody in the room.
But I think what you're saying in your book, though, is, I think every student at some point, I certainly probably did that.
It's a rite of passage.
Right.
It's a rite of passage.
Yes, as my father said, kids will be kids, and that's the case at various ages. But what's different is that the institutions have then said, okay, we will encourage this behavior. That we will.
This is a demand signal,
right? We will see the students as customers and clients, and we have several students in the room, so I'd be interested in your perspective on this later. But to see the trend and the change, I just want to mention one thing too, because I noted it in your book too. I don't actually think that Watergate and Vietnam are the same kind of example in the American experience. I actually think for what you're arguing about in your book, Vietnam is far more important.
Yes.
Watergate were people engaged in criminal activities, bad people doing bad things. The best and the brightest leading the nation down the wrong path under the guise of expertise, I think, plays a much more central role in your story than Watergate.
But I missed Vietnam. I'm 56. I missed Vietnam, but I lived through Watergate. And the only exception I'll take here is to say that we assumed that people in power were people of goodwill relying on experts who were helping them to make good decisions. And when you get to the point where you say, wow, even the president isn't a good guy, and that the people around him, because we just assumed that coming from a working class town like mine, we assumed that everybody in Washington knew what they were doing. And suddenly, remember, one of the great lines from Watergate, when we talk about great moments in Watergate, people always remember, follow the money. My favorite is the guy who said, I think it was Mark Felt, who said, remember, these aren't the brightest guys in the world, and it got out of control. And that's the one that always stayed with me, is that they weren't the brightest guys. But in the university level, I think this point about reading it as a demand signal is where we started to really go wrong in higher education. And in part, that was a market-driven problem of scarcity. Once the baby boom was over, the contraction of the student body combined with this notion that everybody should go to college and take loans meant that you had more and more students who were less and less capable going. And I'm sorry, it always sounds mean to say that, but the fact of the matter is that college used to be a small number of highly qualified students. Now it's a large number of less qualified students going to a broader range of institutions. And those institutions, you can't keep flunking the customer. And if you're going to compete, and again, elite institutions generally don't have to compete, right? Yale and Stanford aren't out, beating the bushes saying, Palo Alto's nicer than New Haven, come live with us. But at institutions that are competing for students, they really are getting down to come and be with us. It's a good experience. You'll like it. You'll prosper. You'll enjoy it. And frankly, college isn't always supposed to be enjoyable. I loved college. I went to, in case anybody asks, I went to Boston University back in the benighted 70s when BU was kind of a big overgrown community college in its day. And there were, I really, really enjoyed it, but there were really uncomfortable moments of, wow, maybe I'm not that smart. Wow, maybe I don't really understand what's happening here. Wow, I just got a C-. That's gonna leave a mark. Wow, I don't really understand these other kids in the room who are, smart or they're from a different place. College isn't supposed to be the Yale example I bring up in the book, I think sums it up, where this young woman just unloads on the housemaster in this famous incident that happened a few years ago over Halloween costumes and sensitivity. And she says, she's talking about Yale, and she says to this professor, Nichols, she says, "This is not an intellectual space. Your job, she says to the professor, is to create a home here." Well, somebody sold that young woman a complete bill of goods about what college is about, because she has it exactly reversed. College is not your home. It's not an intellectual space. It's not a place to go and be comfortable all the time. And that has now become centralized in the college experience in a lot of places, and I think that's really unfortunate.
So you think that then sends the message, or sends people out into the wider world to not be listening, to not engage in conversation where their minds can be changed, and not being open to tolerate opposing points of view, to have Charles Murray come to Middlebury and speak, etc. These are some of the hot button issues for our time on our campuses. How can we have students engage in critical thinking and be serious students, be members of the community of their institution, and being able to express themselves about what it means to be a member of that community, and at the same time allow for the invitation of people who are coming onto campus and presenting views that they adamantly oppose and that they feel in some cases are downright dangerous. And I think those have been the issues that have really set off the biggest firestorms, where people say that this is the intellectual equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater.
And to relate this to this whole problem of expertise, I think all of these campus instances of this kind of shouting down, and this has been going on for a long time. I mean, I can remember I was a young grad student. I didn't start at Georgetown. I started my graduate school years at Columbia, and I went to see a speaker who got shouted off the stage. I never heard a word because there was a demonstration, and I was deprived of making up my own mind about this. And I think it's the culmination of years of the notion that students are there to enlighten the faculty and the community instead of being students. And I think students should be participants in the community, but they are not there. Years ago, I began my teaching career at Dartmouth, where students said, "Well, this is my school. I decide." And I said, I tried to remind this young man. I said, "You petitioned for entry. You were drafted, and this is not a public institution where, this isn't like your tech." I said, you asked for entry into this institution to enter into not just a contractual relationship, but a very important, almost, I don't want to say spiritual relationship, but an important eternal relationship with teachers and students. I'm very old school about this. And I said, I'm interested in what you have to think, but this does not mean that you now set the curriculum and the policies of this institution for the time that you're here. I said, that one day when you're an alum and are part of an alumni association, you want to be part of that, that's great. I said, but you're still in the learning phase, and I think this problem is very much that students come out of this saying, I went to college because I am already smart. And I spent 4 years never really learning that anyone is smarter or more enlightened. Let's leave a loaded term like smarter. That people are not more enlightened than I am, and I went there to, kind of display my enlightenment to others and to be affirmed in what I believe. And I think this is why I always tell the story about the old Jesuit, because even now, in middle age, every time I think I'm really on top of an argument or I really know what I'm thinking, somewhere in the back of my head I see this man with big horn-rimmed glasses and a crew cut saying, "Repent." Because then I stop and say, am I really that right about this? And I think that doubt is really important. And I think when students shout down Charles Murray or engage in violence, they're not learning to have that moment of self-doubt. They're certainly not learning to engage in a civil disagreement. I don't think you have to silently tolerate the presence of anybody on your campus. But you don't have the right to deprive me or anybody else of hearing that point of view.
That's, I think, a point that we'll probably hear more about from the audience. And before we turn it over to the audience, I'd just like to note that we've gone for quite some time in this conversation without mentioning the current President of the United States, who just this day is being heavily criticized for not being civil in his latest round of tweets. And speaking of Twitter, you yourself, though you're highly critical of social media and the ways in which social media have affected the way that we interact as a society, are one of the most active educational and entertaining people on Twitter that one can imagine. And I would assume pretty much everybody in this room already is a follower of yours, but if not, I highly recommend that you do follow Radio Free Tom. But as part of that, you have been, you have not held back in your criticism of candidate Donald Trump and President Donald Trump. And maybe you could just explain that experience, like how that also has kind of, changed your thinking about social media and the way that people interact.
And about the role of knowledge in an enlightened Republican, small r, Republican government. But first, I will explain that my views do not represent the Naval War College, the Defense Department, the U.S. government, my wife, my cat, Jim, Bard, Harvard Extension School, anybody. These are my personal views. Donald Trump did not create the war on expertise, but he surfed it magnificently. And he surfed it with great crudeness when he stands and says, well, who needs experts? He literally said this. He said, what if I didn't have experts? Would it be so bad? Well, we're now in a real-time experiment to find out if that's true. He really reached out and kind of pushed that raw button and said, experts, and this comes back to what we started talking about at the very beginning, that experts are not just people that are exclusive and talking jargon and don't admit their mistakes. They're your enemy. And I think that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I tell a story right at the beginning of the book. People, especially who don't have a lot of education, don't like experts. They don't like professors, especially. I get that. My brother ran a bar. It's really a compliment to call it a bar. It was more like a joint, by the railroad tracks. My brother ran a dumpy little place, and it was a great neighborhood joint. I used to go hang out there after I became a professor, and I'd go visit my brother. One night I walked out, a guy in the bar turns to my brother and he says, "Your brother's a professor, huh?" And my brother said, yeah. And he says, "Huh. Well, he seems like a good guy anyway." Because and Donald Trump seized on that these are not good people, they're your enemy. And he has encouraged this immense lack of civility. That again, that notion of why do you go to social media? Why do you engage with other people? To win, to denigrate them, to knock them in the dirt because you're having a bad day, because you're unemployed, or your life isn't going right, or your kid can't find a job, and instead of kicking the dog, you're going to go on social media and you're going to torch somebody else. And I think he's setting a terrible example for the rest of the country. I think that the way he campaigned, let me just be bipartisan and say the problem, there were a lot of problems with Hillary Clinton. One of them is she played right into the stereotype of the detached, cool wonk of that, educated, smart people are going to handle this. The little people don't need to worry about that. Now, people in this room may feel differently, but I can tell you that people who did not vote for her felt that very keenly from her. And Trump, who may not be the smartest guy in the world, but he has a kind of political insight into how to manipulate feelings like that. He's been on TV a long time. He understands marketing and he understands audiences. He really seized on that to say, I'm the guy who understands you at a basic level. And these eggheads and pointy heads and pencil necks, they don't get you. They're there to hurt you. They're only out for themselves. And I find that to be immensely destructive because this is, it's not just an attack on science. It's an attack on an entire class of people almost as a class enemy. And I suppose I feel that particularly keenly because I don't come from that elite background. When people say, well, you don't understand, how ordinary people live because you're a professor. Well, come back to my hometown and I'll show you how I grew up. and then tell me I don't understand. You know, my parents were high school dropouts. They were Depression-era kids. But we've now, Trump has encouraged, I would argue the president has encouraged this kind of, social resentment that says if you run into anybody who has education or who disagrees with you or tells you that what you believe is wrong. I had one of these face-to-face kind of moments we were talking about earlier where someone said to me, but Tom, unemployment is completely out of control. And I said, do you really believe that, when Donald Trump says it could be 42%? And he says, well, it's probably not 42%, but it's way high. And he said, he said, what if I just feel that way? And he literally said, well, what if I just feel that way? And I said, well, you're wrong. And so you're just wrong. And I'm here, and that was me I'm going to be an expert who insists on facts and empirical foundation, and I'm going to tell you that I don't care how you feel. And that conversation didn't go well.
But I don't care if you feel that 25% of the federal budget is spent on foreign aid when it's less than 1%. We need to have real information to make real decisions in very difficult times. But before we get too far afield, maybe we can have a few questions from the audience before we then continue the conversations at reception number 2. So, yes.
Hi, I'm Fatima. I'm from Mali. I'm part of the BGI program. So I have a question and I have a comment. My first question is about the role of activism and social movement in your on your ideology of expertise. And I said it because of your comment on students being quiet or students not being an expert to complain or not being an expert to make some judgments. But we see a lot especially here in the US campuses where a lot of students feel discriminated. There's a lot of injustice happening on college campus where students create movements and they go against it and claim their rights. So I don't know what's your thoughts about that. And then my comment is about the social media. I do understand that you do have a lot of criticism about social media. I also think that it's very important for us to also look at the positive side of social media in terms of how it's brought change. Especially in my country, I'm from Mali, so many times we're able to really make the government listen to us is when we organized marches and we started through social media, like the Arab uprising. Social media was very helpful during that as well. So, and I think it's very important to also look at the positive side.
I don't want to be misunderstood. I love the internet. And I really like social media. I mean, as Jim points out, I'm a really active participant in social media. And I love the fact that it's made the world a smaller place. That I learn a lot by being on social media, by just encountering people that I would never encounter in the course of an ordinary day. Even when I disagree with them, I'm made aware of their existence. And I think that's a really important thing. And I can just tell you that, the internet came of age when I did, so I was kind of an internet nerd. I feel like I'm about to say, before you kids were born, I had a modem that made those loud, ugly noises, and I loved that stuff. And so I've been an enthusiastic kind of global information partaker. But your question about activism, and especially where it relates to social media, but let me say a word about activism first. Look, I think it's the role of young people to be rebellious. I think that's just, as we were talking about earlier, because I'm not really that comfortable with, it's almost strange to me if a 19-year-old says, I think the world's just perfect the way it is, I think it's fine. That's almost unnatural, right? I mean, by part of being, coming out of adolescence into young adulthood, is he's saying, you old people screwed everything up. With that said, what I don't like, and maybe this is because my own politics are of a moderate conservative bent, I don't like rapid change. I don't like radical politics. I mean, that's by my internal constitution, I'm not that kind of person. I fear activism I reject or I oppose the activism that I suspect has more to do with self-actualization than justice. That's when I start to draw a line and say, do you really know what you're protesting against? Or are you protesting because it simply makes you feel good to protest, or because you're expressing yourself? And I mean, when I was back in the 70s, when I started college, wow, back in the 70s. One of the big issues on campus that there were endless protests about were to shut down nuclear energy. Now, 40 years later, even one of the most liberal presidents, Barack Obama, John McCain, crossed the boundary saying, we should have built more nuclear power plants. And here I am 40 years later going, right? Maybe that wasn't a good idea, and I think I knew a lot of people in Boston who were in the anti-nuclear movement, and I just doubted their sincerity. I think if you're going to be an activist and if you're going to raise hell, then make sure that you are grounded in knowing what you're talking about and that this is really important to you. With that said, the Arab Spring, the Arab Uprising, I think social media is one of the most powerful weapons against dictatorship and oppression there is in the world. I think there's no gun bigger than an iPhone. And I think that people like Putin and other dictators in the world fear that telephone more than they fear. There you go. If it's Putin, I'm busy. And so I'm a big fan of that. I'm a big supporter of it. But I don't believe in activism for the sake of activism.
And just to be clear about what we were talking about before also too, is it really activism when you're prohibiting somebody from speaking? And to kind of say, well, we're going to be intolerant of this form of speech under the heading of tolerance, I think that's a tough needle to thread. So anyway, but good questions, thank you. Yeah.
I wanted to start by saying that I agree with a lot of what you're saying.
Great, good meeting.
I
think something else is coming now.
So the one thing that I just questioned is that you spoke about how sort of as you grew up, there was the working class Americans where going to college was a rare thing. So in our day and age, yes, college is basically, I would say basically a norm, right? Do you think that's because of a lot of the stuff you're talking about, or is it because of the way that the economy has grown to exclude those jobs? And the fact that President Trump is trying to bring a lot of those working class jobs back to the States, could that possibly change this notion of every kid has to go to college in order to get a good job?
That's a great question. I don't actually think that the mass movement toward college is because of the changing economy. I think it's because of the failure of high schools to guarantee that the graduates of people with a high school diploma have basic literacy and can read and write. Colleges are especially, I would say I'm trying to think of how to do this without sounding too prejudicial, less selective, or kind of the lower kind of open enrollment kind of environment for some of these colleges is really just a way of finishing high school. And that means, because to me that means high schools have fallen down on the job. And we can get into a whole other, this is where I'm not an expert. I did not put a chapter, I can tell you, I talked with my editors about it at Oxford. I did not include a chapter on K through 12 because I am not a K through 12 teacher. And I really would have been violating the expert oath, the expert prime directive for you Star Trek nerds. So, but I do think teachers, I know a lot of teachers, I'm married to one, and there is a lot of the teaching to the test behavior where students are not coming out as skilled and as just basically literate as they should be. And so people are saying, well, go to college, because that becomes, for an employer, basically certifying what you should have known in high school. The other problem, and I'm going to raise this because I know a lot of parents, people have developed this social norm of, well, my kid has to go to college. Other people's kids are tradesmen. I've had my daughter's a teenager. She asked me, do I have to go to college? And she's kind of young to think about it, but I said, no. College is not for everybody. It's not, some people don't enjoy it. You don't need a college degree to be a professional. I used to live in Vermont. There was a glassworks near where I lived. It was really cool, and people who do that make a lot of money. You don't need to go to college to be a professional glass worker. Or a master electrician. Those are all great jobs. I think that we have, and on this I'm going to put the blame on liberalism rather than conservatives. That this notion that college is your destiny, work is what you do if you didn't get into college. I think that has been a terrible movement mostly among the American left for a long time, but also, again, part of this kind of social one-upmanship of, oh, your son didn't go to college. Oh, I'm very sorry. Well, again, one of my best friends when I was teaching up at Dartmouth was a guy who dropped out of the University of Vermont. He said, I got high and skied a lot. He said, and that wasn't for me, and I wasn't doing well. And I said, okay. And he dropped out, and what he was really good at was running businesses and restaurants and being an entrepreneur. And we were talking about this while we were sitting on his 6-figure spread next to his private trout stream in Vermont. It's not for everybody. So I think we have to back away from this. During the campaign, I think it was Marco Rubio who said we need more welders than philosophers. I think that a lot of this can be solved. Well, two things are going to happen. There's going to be an education bubble just like the housing bubble. It's going to burst. This can't go on like this. It simply is not sustainable. And the other is high schools have to start picking up the slack again and really doing that job of education.
But the education bubble, if it exists, is also created like the housing bubble, in which the Congress, the banking system, and the recipients of the money have found a system which has just been awash with a lot of free money. Right. Free to everyone except for the students who are going into enormous debt. And so I think the not only the economic consequences, but the social consequences of this massive debt burden, where you have people getting out of college who now have such a huge weight on them that their options are very limited, that it's directed people in ways that we couldn't have imagined, how it's constrained their lives. So I think if and when that bubble does burst, we need to do a lot of hard thinking about what comes next.
And about, because this is a pebble in my shoe about these issues, about the housing bubble in particular, where people have said to me, the housing bubble, this possible education bubble, you experts screwed this up by creating this. And this is where, as an expert, I bristle. Experts did not, there were people, bankers are not experts, they're business people. They are there to make money. It's not their job to tell you not to buy a house, right? If you actually look at expert opinion about the housing crisis, there were a lot of economists saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And the same with education. There are a lot of people in education who very quietly are saying, if it's going to cost you $200,000 to go to a not very good school where you will never recoup that, maybe you shouldn't do that. I say it very openly, and I say it on social media, where I get immediately dogpiled by angry millennials who say, you don't understand. I understand. I didn't pay off my last student loan until I was about 41. So I get it. But this notion of offloading this personal responsibility to experts can only advise you. We can't really tell you what to do. And I think when this education bubble, when this does come around, I guarantee you people are going to say, you're a professor, you should have warned us. You experts should have told us. And there are going to be a lot of us standing around saying, well, we did tell you to stop giving you what you want. But that's part of this tension between experts and the public now.
Yeah. How about any questions from over here? Yes, sir.
I have kind of a different focus. I think we're talking about facts and the ascertainment of real objective facts, and teaching from the very beginning children how to analyze a problem, solve a problem, and then also accumulate facts. So first and foremost, we want to teach them how to think. Secondly, we want them to accumulate whatever knowledge we think is essential, the core curriculum, and then what they think they want to do. And I think that there are two problems in American education. As you said, one is with fixing high schools. But this, compared to a handset phone, a manual typewriter compared to a PC, makes Donald Trump the greatest philosopher of the 21st century. Who knew global warming could be so complicated? Who knew North Korea, China could be so complicated? Who knew healthcare could be so complicated? The world is complicated. And the dissertation you have about expertise has to do with facts, the ascertainment of facts, all the rest, but then colored, as you said, by people's personalities, by their prejudices, by their faith, because a lot of what is going on is a movement from facts and objectivity to faith-based facts, the alternative facts. I believe it because my political group says it's true. So you have a deliberate move to political propaganda, to spin, to distortion. And that's a terrible thing. So we don't know what real facts are, we don't know how to analyze, we don't know what that is, and we're compounding it with a political distortion.
As people have been, there are a lot of my current former students out there in social media, and they will fact check me on this. So I sometimes shock them at the outset of a lot of my classes when I say, and I'm talking about my undergraduates, not my military guys, because that's graduate education, a different kind of thing. But in my undergraduate classes, I often say, look, I don't care about your I don't care what you think about politics. Because I say, now by that I mean, you're not going to get an A or an F depending on whether you're a conservative or a liberal. All I care about is, how do you present your position? How do you reason through the thing you're arguing for? That's the quality of your thought is what I don't care if you're a Marxist, I don't care if you have a picture of Mussolini in your room. I just want to hear how you think and think things through. And I think students are sometimes genuinely surprised by that. Again, because there is this kind of hardening of faith-based lines in the academy and out in society. But I think that teachers, we have the responsibility to overcome that. And I think of teaching as a sacred profession. I really think of it as a sacred trust. And I just, on this, I think that it can be, and I actually think that it's very welcome in the classroom. I have to say, I will just put this out as a mildly self-congratulatory thing. I didn't write this because I have some beef or, after 30 years of getting miserable teaching evaluations, I said I'm going to get even with all those little kids, and write this book. I've actually had a lot of success in the classroom, and I think it's because students, I think just as it's their nature to be rebellious, it's also their nature to be inquiring and questioning and to participate in that relationship. And I think that they don't react well to teachers who say, I have two things in the book. We'll get to the other one in a minute. One of the phrases I hate the most is a teacher who says, oh, I learn just as much from my students as they learn from me. No, they don't. And if that's true, you stink as a teacher. The other expression I really hate is let's agree to disagree. I hate that expression so much. That's a way of saying, I'm tired of arguing with you and I'm right. I always, when people say, let's agree to disagree, I say, no, let's agree that you're wrong. And then we'll end this conversation.
So let's take one more question, and then we'll segue into the reception. Yes. So.
Thank you very much. I would like to hear your perspective on the role of depth of expertise in the growing divide between the left and right of the United States during and after the election, and also similarly divide between the people who supported the governments in the Middle East and the people who wanted to rebel against it.
I'm sorry, the second part was about the...
So it's similar,
in the Middle East, you said?
Yeah,
I'm going to stay away from that partly as a matter of expertise, because I'm not a Middle East expert. But this division between right and left in America, it's become fashionable to say that the war on facts, the war on science, is primarily being conducted by the right. One of the things that I found writing the book is it's there on the left too. There's a lot of faith-based nonsense going on the left. The anti-vaccine movement, the GMO fixation, even in the climate science business. You have people who are climate science deniers, but you also have people that are climate science theologians who say, 100 years from now, we'll all be dead. And I know this is a matter of faith. Whereas, there are scientists in the middle saying, well, this is a little more complicated than that. I found that people express what really concerns. I almost wish I could limit the depth of expertise to one group and say, this is just a malady of, people in Indiana right now. What I found is that it is across society, but expressed differently. Men express it differently than women. Southerners differently than Northerners, people on the left differently from people on the right. But common to it all is, going back to your comment, sir, is it's just faith. It's important to me, or as Jim was saying earlier, it's intrinsic to my identity, and therefore it cannot be challenged. And I think going back to your point about universities and campus toleration, part of why we get that shouting down phenomenon is I can't risk having this person talk because these are things that are so intrinsic to my personality, to my self-identity, that they cannot even be uttered. Whereas I think truly self-confident people say, you know what, I'm not afraid of hearing it. I am old school about the First Amendment. What's the answer to bad speech? More speech. Let them talk. Let them make asses of themselves. Let them present their stupid argument and you take it on. But when you shut people down, what you're really saying is, I'm so insecure about my beliefs and my self-identity that I must prohibit these words from ever being uttered because they terrify me so badly. And I think that is part of this death of expertise, it's part of that narcissism that says, I cannot endure any challenge to facts that threaten my identity. And that really worries me.
And you know, the work on the big sort, and you know, all of these dynamics that we see driving this, it strikes me that on all sides of these debates, we, at least in the United States, I think it is a bit different in the Middle East, and I was living there through some of those events, so we can talk about that later. But in the United States, I think, you know, there's almost an addictive quality to this unfounded sense of certainty and righteous indignation.
Yes.
People are just kind of hooked on it.
Well, in one place, I think, where the United States and the Middle East have become more alike in that sense is we're going through a period here in the United States where conspiracy theories are on the rise again. And conspiracy theories are like plate mail armor against facts, against learning anything. Because people who engage in conspiracy theories are very creative. That everything, no matter what you say, if you say, look, here's some kind of whiffy evidence, they say, see, it proves my point. If you say, well, there's no evidence at all, they say, that's how good the conspiracy is, that there's no evidence. Now, I think in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, I know my own background, I'm part Greek. In the 70s, when there was a lot of turmoil in Greece, I was there with family, conspiracy theories flying through the air. That's how people react to the sense that the world is out of control. And I think what's underlying all of this in the United States and in other developed countries, that the world is moving faster. It is changing. Going back to your point about economic change. And the way people cope with this speed of change is to explain it away, or to make up conspiracies about it, or to reject it as a plot against them because it's hurting them somehow. I think in time that passes, but the last time we had this much conspiracy theorizing and kind of this populist anti-elite feeling was an unfortunate time known as the 1930s, and that didn't end well. So I'm kind of hoping that globally this fever kind of cools off, and I think it's already, if you want to be hopeful about it, just a year ago we would have been sitting here saying, wow, Europe is just sliding into the abyss, right? Brexit and Marine Le Pen and all that. A year later, all that looks a little bit alarmist, right? I mean, even the Brexiteers, I was just reading something this morning about, there was a piece in a British newspaper saying that how the Brexiteers lost control of Brexit, because a year later everybody's saying, we didn't really want to do this thing, So maybe there's a hopeful sign there, but I think we're in a dangerous period where people are reacting to change by faith-based approaches to knowledge, by conspiracy theories, by identifying social enemies, by polarizing campuses as battlegrounds. It's none of this, including the kind of behavior we talked about the president, none of this is sustainable. We are in a true crisis in the sense of it has to go one direction or the other, because we cannot live in this gray area, this limbo of anger and resentment forever. It just can't go on this way.
Well, I think it's good to end on a hopeful note. So thank you very much to Tom Nichols. And thank you to the Vance Center for hosting us, to the VJI students for coming, to the U.S. Foreign Policy Institute scholars for attending. I hope that all of you will continue the conversations in the reception, and that you will consider purchasing this